My name is Roger Yu, the Dean of College of Arts and Sciences at NYIT. On behalf of the college, again, I welcome you. Now, this is my honor to introduce the president of NYIT. Since becoming the president in year 2000, Dr. Edward Giuliano has led NYIT to be an institution in higher learning with distinction and national, global, and digital footprint in a wide range of academic programs at undergraduate level and the graduate and professional levels. Dr. Edward Giuliano is also an eloquent spokesman for the environment, sustainability, and global education and technology in education. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Edward Giuliano.
Thanks, Frank. Well, good evening and welcome as Roger, let me echo Roger and welcome you to the NYIT Auditorium on Broadway. I know we have numbers of special guests tonight and they have been far and wide over the world, but I'm not sure they've been on the stage in Broadway before. So you can add that to your resume, my evening in Broadway. Certainly the topic for this evening, which is Asia-Pacific security, has taken a few curious turns in the last month when if you announced this topic 6 weeks ago, we would be thinking of battleships and airplanes and maybe China's military industrial complex in the making. But today we think about tsunamis, tectonic shifts, the economics of safety for millions of people. There's no doubt that the Asia-Pacific security landscape is changing, and those changes are going to affect the rest of the world for years and years to come. NYIT, as Dean Yu said, has committed ourselves to being a model 21st century global university. This year we have, like every year, we have 15,000 students. But this year we have students representing 106 nations at NYIT and its several campuses. But what's interesting is that nearly 1 out of 10 of those 15,000 students comes from Asia or has an origin from Asia. So our university recognizes Asia as a major source of interdisciplinary education and educational exchanges. I get there 2 to 3 times a year myself. Students in our programs and sites and campuses, whether in New York or in China, have proven themselves great contributors to the global knowledge economy. We have today with us an individual who has been instrumental in establishing the relations between the United States and Asia. He served as the Office of the Legal Advisor of the United States Department of State on political, military, East Asian, Pacific affairs. His career in the private sector has spanned Hong Kong, Korea, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and China. Today, he is the president of the National Committee on United States-China Relations, the oldest American organization dedicated to fostering sound and productive relations between two superpowers. It's my pleasure to welcome to the NYIT Auditorium on Broadway and to the New York Institute of Technology, Stephen Orlins.
Thanks. By the way, as I look at the audience, it reminds me a bit of law school. You don't have to backbench. You can move forward. There's some empty seats. There's some empty seats out front, and Admiral Willard promises he's not going to be calling on people. It's only going to be volunteers. It's my pleasure to introduce Admiral Willard. If you've got his bio, I think if I went over all the awards he's won, all the meritorious service awards, and his service to this country, it would take the entire hour that we have allotted. Of course, what is missing from that part of the bio is his role in the movie Top Gun. For those of you who don't know, I think you were the technical advisor on Top Gun. So he worked with Tom Cruise, and in one of the final scenes, I believe you were the MiG pilot who I think had a gesture towards Tom Cruise, which was the other way around, that Tom Cruise had a gesture towards you. So it's really someone who is extraordinarily accomplished both in the military and in Hollywood. For those of you, since we sit so far from Honolulu, I just want to give you a sense of how massive PACOM, which Admiral Willard commands, is. You know, it's got 325,000 military and civilian personnel. He not only commands the Pacific Fleet, which he formerly ran, but the U.S. Army of the Pacific, the Marines of the Pacific, and the Air Force of the Pacific. It has 180 ships, 1,500 aircraft, and of course it encompasses 1/2 of the globe. It has in it two of the three largest economies in the world, which of course includes China, and that's going to be our focus today. Clearly, the rise of China, or as the Chinese like to say, its peaceful development, is the most serious strategic challenge that the United States will face in the 21st century. How Admiral Willard and his colleagues confront that challenge is going to determine the future of the NYIT students, our children, and everyone else on this planet. One of the great pleasures I spent my career, as I think was briefly mentioned, on Wall Street. One of the great pleasures of having become president of the National Committee is that I've gotten to know some of the senior members of the U.S. military. And it's really something which I didn't experience early in my career, but having now grown to know some of them, it's truly a pleasure. And what Admiral Willard represents, in fact, is the best and the brightest of that group. And in the 18 months since he assumed the command of PACOM, I've gotten to know him somewhat, and it's really been an honor and a pleasure to know that we are served by America's best and brightest. So please join me in welcoming Admiral Willard to the podium.
Thank you,
Just
Steve.
sit right here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the National Committee for this opportunity to speak this evening. Thank you, Edward, for this incredible venue. I've not spoken on Broadway before. This is the night before I may have no salary, so depending on how our Congress acts over the next 24 or 48 hours, I'll either be headed in my airplane away from New York or remaining for the rest of the venue this weekend. As the commander of Pacific Command, I'm often asked, what is my greatest challenge? And my answer is consistently the China relationship. Not because I think the United States military in the Pacific is on an inevitable road to conflict with the PRC, but because it's a relationship that we must get right. And getting it right is fraught with challenges. For that reason, I appreciate the National Committee and your work to foster improved China relations. My chief advisor on China, in fact, my two chief advisors on China, are members of this organization. And my predecessor, Admiral Tim Keating, serves on your board of directors. And in that way, you're in a strong position to help influence PACOM's views and guide our approach to properly managing the United States-China military relationship. Since my last visit to New York, there's been no lack of Asia-Pacific issues to occupy our time. I know I speak for all Americans when I offer condolences to the people of Japan for their profound losses. 30,000 citizens of Japan may have perished. 500,000 are currently homeless, and the damage in northern Honshu is absolutely staggering. My wife and I visited one of the worst hit areas and can attest to the scenes that I think transcend the most dramatic news coverage on TV. The March 11 9.0 earthquake, the 10-meter tsunami, and the multiple nuclear reactor accidents at Fukushima Daiichi have held my focus for the past 3 weeks, and it's not over yet. In fact, I was visiting with the Chief of Naval Operations today as his advisor came out and announced that there was an additional 7.4 aftershock and a 1-meter tsunami that once again affected the power of Fukushima Daiichi. So we're not out of the woods yet. U.S. Pacific Command has about 18,000 of our forces in direct support to the Japanese Self-Defense Force, who've assumed the lead role in Japan's disaster response, humanitarian relief effort, and reactor accident mitigation effort. The people of Japan, and especially their defense forces, have shown great courage, determination, and self-sufficiency, as we saw. And the level of cooperation and collaboration between the servicemen and women of the United States and Japan has been inspiring, and I think is reflective of the maturity of the United States-Japan alliance. Natural disasters, however, represent just one of many challenges and challengers in this most important region of the world. North Korea continues to represent one of the most dangerous of them. Caught up in an ongoing succession amidst nuclearization concerns, deadly provocations, we had 2 last year against the South, and weapons proliferation, Kim Jong-il will undoubtedly remain bellicose and unpredictable to the very end. Violent extremist organizations such as Lashkar-e-Taiba in South Asia, Jamaat Islamiyah, and Abu Sayyaf Group in Southeast Asia continue to exploit regional vulnerabilities and expand their influence. And of course, China, their incomparable military expansion even beyond its already largest standing army in the world, and recent assertiveness chafes the nerves of its neighbors, even as they rely on unprecedented trade and financial relations in this second largest economy in the world. Despite these challenges, I remain optimistic that the relative security that this region has enjoyed for decades can continue into the foreseeable future. My optimism is founded on the belief that the United States, together with our allies and partners, remain committed to Asia-Pacific security and its peace, and that multilateral organizations like ASEAN and the East Asia Summit continue to mature and strengthen in the face of pressures that they remain impassive. U.S. alliances with Australia, Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, and Thailand continue to form a bulwark against the region's greatest challenges and challengers. Interleaved with growing U.S. partnerships across the region, they provide for levels of cooperation and convergence in a wide area of common interest, such as disaster response and humanitarian assistance, maritime security, counter-piracy, and counter-proliferation. India is one of the most important of these partnerships. As President Obama affirmed in the 2010 National Security Strategy, the United States seeks to work with India to promote stability in South Asia and elsewhere in the world. As the world's largest democracy with a growing economy and influence throughout South and Southeast Asia, India and the United States are natural partners. However, our histories have led to a relatively brief relationship and a need to work closely to establish a strategic partnership that meets the needs of both these nations. And still, the elephant in the room remains China. Secretary of Defense Bob Gates has twice proposed high-level dialogue on important issues such as strategic nuclear, cyberspace, and space. And China remains considering. We believe China is essential to shaping North Korea's behavior. We believe China will play a key role in the security of the South China Sea, a vital maritime commons that is a declared U.S. national interest. And we believe China's conduct in space and cyberspace must change and become more responsible to ensure the future security of those common domains, both increasingly crucial to an informationalized world. United States Pacific Command's role in this region is oversight of Asia-Pacific security and the maintenance of peace, both in our national interest and in the interest of our allies and partners. And while we endeavor to achieve this with, by, and through those partners, there is a national imperative that we must meet. In my congressional testimonies, and I have 4 on schedule next week, I'm always asked whether or not I have the means, the forces, authorities, and national support to defend our nation's interests in PACOM. And my answer has always been yes. We believe the U.S. relationship with China must evolve to be constructive and contribute to Asia-Pacific security, never threaten it, and not put that question to a test. You're helping to ensure that that's the case. So I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to engage with you tonight. My intent is to take a chair and look forward to your questions. And I hope we can have a meaningful exchange that will help me in my responsibilities to maintain security and peace in this most important region of the world, and perhaps share the security perspectives that will help you in your business. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that survey of the region. Let me start. I'll use the moderator's prerogative and start with a question. And I'll tell you a story about a CCTV program that I did recently, which was audience participation. There were 50 people in the audience, and the subject of the program was the valuation of the Chinese currency. And I was answering questions from the audience and from the moderator. And one of the members of the audience, who was a manufacturer, stood up and he said, "Why is it that the United States, in every single policy that it adopts, whether it's RMB valuation, whether it's intellectual property, whether it's global warming, whether it's our security relationship with China, that we seek to restrict China's development and contain China?" And the audience, which was a bit smaller than this, stood up and started applauding him. Everyone agreed with that, and I said, look, I've served in the U.S. government. That just isn't true. There is nobody in the U.S. government who believes this. But what it reflects is the single greatest problem that we have with China, which is this strategic mistrust. And what happens now, in other words, you talk about strengthening our relationships with our allies, who just happen to encircle China, and our partners who just happen to encircle China. And the Chinese perception of this is we are seeking, not contain in the Cold War sense, but we're seeking to, kind of encircle them. And then they combine that with something which is directly under your command, which is the surveillance that we have engaged in recently. And what the Chinese tell me is, especially in the Hainan area where we had the impeccable incident, the U.S. Navy and our planes and our ships are going closer and more frequently than was ever the case before, and was ever the case with the Soviet Union, who was truly an enemy, and China believes in what we say is they're not. So how should you counter this perception of encirclement? So specifically, what should we be increasing? And this is from the Chinese, not from the U.S. Should we be increasing the number of missions that we're conducting off China's coast, again, putting aside the issue that they disagree with us on the legality of that, and should we be doing it closer?
great comments and wonderful question. I'd like to go back to the beginning premise before I get into surveillance activities and talk about containment, because we've endeavored to understand China's strategy vis-a-vis the United States, how they view the U.S. and how they view our activities. My charter is to improve military-to-military relations with China. Obviously, renminbi valuation is someone else's responsibility, but nonetheless, much of this context is wrapped up in the perceptions that China has of the United States. And we've tried to understand not only how China thinks about the United States, but quite literally what China's strategic approach, framework is toward the United States. And it was illuminating to me when we determined that they are embarked on a counter-containment strategy. And one of the early remarks that I made to my staff as we had developed this understanding of China's strategic approach beyond the engagement with the United States for the purpose of economic development, but a counter-containment strategy mostly in the Asia-Pacific region. My comment was, well, we're not containing China. The activities that I would undertake, the military activities that I would undertake to contain another nation or to contain the military expansion of another nation, we have none of them ongoing. We did with the Soviet Union. So encirclement is perhaps, by virtue of what was the Allied consequence of World War II and what has developed in terms of partnerships, given China's place central in Asia. The fact that the United States has allies and partners that are in the surrounding geographic area of China is, in many cases, coincidental. I mean, a consequence of World War II, and from the standpoint of partners, is opportunistic. It's basically where the economies have been and who those partners were formed with over time. So China finds itself having emerged, just a few decades ago, re-emerging into a geographic environment where, were I Chinese, I would probably view the United States' presence as encirclement, as you point out, when in fact there is no active containment ongoing. Different set of actions that any military commander with my responsibilities would undertake. So the counter-containment, the fact that China is embarked on a strategy that is incorrect, that miscalculates United States intent, is in itself a dynamic that we all ought to consider. I mean, how do you think about a U.S. strategy vis-a-vis China and a Chinese strategy vis-a-vis the U.S., where in either case we might misunderstand or misperceive the intentions of the other party? And what are the risks attendant to that? And I think there are some. On the subject of surveillance, certainly I am responsible to surveil the air, sea, undersea, land domains throughout the Asia-Pacific region to understand what is occurring. In the case of China's impressive military expansion over the past 2 decades, one of my responsibilities has been to understand that completely. And to the extent the United States and Chinese military-to-military relationship is not conducive to fostering a level of trust and a level of understanding between the two of us, then the two of us are embarked in endeavoring to surveil and understand one another in other ways. So just as the United States conducts surveillance activities not just around China, but around much of the Asia-Pacific region, China conducts surveillance activities from space and elsewhere against their uncertainties in the region. there has not been an increase, as you suggest, or as the Chinese perception suggests. One of the insights that I've learned over many, many years of doing the military business in the Asia-Pacific region is that for most nations that don't have the capabilities and capacities that the United States has to perceive areas around them, their perceptions are based on literally what they see, not necessarily what they sense. So I would offer that China and many of the other 36 nations in the Asia-Pacific, in the U.S. PACOM area of responsibility, don't know our level of activity unless we tell them. Mm-hmm. And the Chinese have elected in just recent years to spend more time in company with our forces that operate routinely in the region, shadowing and so forth, such that their perception is, as you suggest, that we have somehow increased activities around China when in fact statistically they have not.
Yeah. How do we, I mean, there are many in the policy community who would say the only way that China will become our enemy is if we make them our enemy. And how do you avoid that negative dynamic where their perception, and you know, again, obviously you were not involved in the finance area, but their policy positions which we take that the Chinese look at and they kind of go, wait, we don't understand how you can be taking that except if you want to restrict our development. And what happens is that bleeds over into the security, or the security bleeds over into the finance, and it bleeds over into the human rights. So you have this mistrust that pervades all aspects of the relationship. How do you kind of prevent this, what might be called a downward spiral?
Yeah, thanks. We're concerned about a downward spiral as well, and I'll talk a little bit about the past year and our experience with China, and maybe help with that. But you know, again, I would offer in the business arena, in many of the areas that you engage with China in, to the extent that China is complaining about constraints and restraints being imposed by the United States, are they confusing it with competition? Because after all, you know, they're fierce competitors in the marketplace. And I would offer they're going to be fierce competitors in the security area. We don't mind competition, and we don't mind competitors as America. But when it becomes a downward spiral, when in fact the relationship or the level of trust in the relationship is on a negative trend, that ought to be concerning to all of us. The United States has been appealing to China now, you know, certainly during the time that I've been the U.S. PACOM commander, but I would offer for many, many years, to establish a regular, continuous military-to-military dialogue, because we recognize, you know, and I think I understand China's structure. I understand the People's Liberation Army structure, and I've had at least undertaken some study to understand the ministerial structures within China as well. And it's important that on the People's Liberation Army side of this dynamic, that there be dialogue enough to establish a level of trust, and if not trust, then at least understanding between these two nations. We have concluded that in some ways our perception of mill-to-mill relations, military-to-military relations, which I have with 34 nations in the region, that the United States form of relations is somewhat inimical to the Chinese organizational construct, that philosophically mill-to-mill relations for China are inherently political, where mill-to-mill relations for the United States have been, in the past, inherently practical. where we engage at low levels as well as upper echelons to both understand one another's policies, but to spend a lot of time building trust mill to mill, whether it's Armies, Navies, Air Force, or Marine Corps. And we've been unable to establish that continuity with the Chinese. At the end of the day, they've got to want it too. So the military-to-military relationship has been subject to fits and starts with disagreements between our nations and our governments, and we desire something much more formidable than that. And we've had the benefit of a restart of mill-to-mill relations. I think you saw Secretary of Defense Bob Gates' visit to China occur just before President Hu visited Washington, and that was probably the high end of the mill-to-mill engagement that has occurred in the past year.
What do you think would happen? I should step back. You know, I was a student in Taiwan 40 years ago, and you could not even read about mainland China when you were in Taiwan. Obviously, the cross-strait relations have improved beyond what I would have ever dreamed of 40 years ago. What would happen to this strategic mistrust? And you may answer this by saying it's too hypothetical and I can't answer. But what would happen to this mistrust if you had an agreement between the mainland and Taiwan on non-use of force? So we've had the president of Taiwan and the president of mainland China kind of come to a general agreement that no independence, no reunification, no force. And assuming the political winds blow correctly, you get an agreement between them which basically says, okay, the status quo will go on for many, many years. Not only our professional lives, the professional lives of our children. What would that do to kind of the relationships between the military? Because once upon a time, it's now changed, that strategic mistrust emanated from Taiwan. Now we're beginning to fear way beyond Taiwan. We used to believe their capability was strictly a theater capability intended to interdict us from intervening in a Taiwan.
But it's more than capability. I mean, it's doctrinal, it's political statements, that have very clearly established their prerogatives in the South China Sea, in areas that are of vital interest to the United States, that are well beyond Taiwan. To your point, I guess my offer would be, were that declaration made, is it a political declaration or is it a sincere level of effort? So right now, on the other side of the Taiwan Straits, is an unprecedented combat arms buildup aimed at Taiwan. 1,500 ballistic missiles. Essentially, the Taiwan Strait has been completely covered by an integrated air and missile a missile defense system with high-end surface-to-air missiles and front-end fifth-generation fighters. This was a buildup that occurred just prior to the 2007 elections and has not stopped, or was built up in 2007 and has not declined. On the contrary, continues to be improved. So at some point, we have to reconcile the political overtures that are made between these two presidents, realizing that there are elections that take place and changes in governance that take place a year from now, and the reality of what exists across strait, which is heavily biased toward a combat capability on the mainland side aimed at Taiwan.
I would argue that the buildup started in 1995 and 96 after the United States took actions which to the Chinese violated commitments we had made. It related to the visit of the president of Taiwan to the United States, which the Chinese had understood that we were not going to allow to happen. And at that point in time, they believed that we were going to forever support Taiwan independence, and they began that military buildup. That prior to then, they actually had some capability, but it was quite limited, and that would be the time you would measure it from. So what we really, this is not for people in the Pentagon, but for people in the State Department and the President, is to think about how to kind of bring it back to that time when there was much more strategic trust, when they did not believe we were going to support Taiwan independence. But that's clearly not, what would you say in the military, within your pay grade. I'm going to open it to questions from the floor. Let me just ask one final question, which is, are there small steps that we should be taking to kind of improve the relationship on a mill-to-mill basis? So kind of joint search and rescue, Coast Guard cooperation, other things where you're not going to get the big, overwhelming breakthrough, but are there a lot of little things that we should be doing, that we at the National Committee should in fact be advocating to the Chinese? In fact, I'll see their Ministry of National Defense week after next.
Yeah, and I think the answer is absolutely, and we're doing it. Lots of little things, track 2, track 1.5, opportunities to conduct low-key search and rescue operations together. Our Coast Guards do interact. I attend meetings with PLA members, international, multilateral conferences and so forth, all helpful. I will attend the Strategic and Economic Dialogue at the invitation of Secretary Clinton. I attended last year in Beijing, and while that was not a mill-to-mill interaction, it laid the groundwork for a couple-hour meeting with a military counterpart the day following the major plenary. So we're taking the actions that we can take, that the Chinese are willing to take right now. We've established a whole host. In fact, I sat with one of the counterparts of Secretary Gates in my office in Hawaii a little more than a year ago now, and we exchanged ideas on all the areas of common interest that we had, many of them not surprising: counter-piracy, humanitarian assistance, disaster response, medical medicine, diver and submarine safety. I mean, just fundamental things that militaries exchange on all the time, and agreed that we ought to seek opportunities in those areas of common interest. The challenge is that with a cessation of mill-to-mill relations, opportunities to conduct those incremental steps were lost. And hopefully, with the visit of Secretary Gates, his counterpart visit coming up, we'll see a resumption of those opportunities. So we seek them where we can, but at the end of the day, despite the overtures, China gets a vote. And if the PLA is not interested, we're going to have a challenging time, mill-to-mill engagement. So I would offer that in all of your engagements with your Chinese counterparts to continue to encourage that, though it may fall on the minister's ears and not People's Liberation Army members' ears. I think that it's very valuable to try and encourage them to seek opportunities to work at the trust factor with the United States military where they can.
Do we have a hotline now between MND and Ministry of National Defense and the Pentagon?
We do.
So we do now.
I've not used it. My predecessor, I think, attempted to use it 3 times, and he was unsuccessful. He was 0 for 3. So, so it's not the red phone, that we enjoyed with the Soviet Union. China's not the Soviet Union. So, so right now it's a convenience between our Office of the Secretary of Defense and their Ministry of Defense. And unfortunately, someone has to pick up at the other end if we're going to have that conversation.
The white paper that the State Council Information put out on their defense posture, anything in it surprise you?
I think our sense was more negativity on the part of, in the notion of competition with the United States military. So concerning in that regard. And again, we're hopeful that the recommencement of military-to-military dialogue, which is occurring, will assist in perhaps overcoming that. But you know, an acknowledgement, which is a little unusual for the Chinese, I think, in a white paper format, an acknowledgement of the tenuous nature of the relationship between our two militaries.
Mm-hmm. Let me open the floor to questions. You see a bunch of hands, so we'll start right there. It's tough to see. Kind of, no, up closer. There's a. And identify yourself, please.
Sure. Thank you. I'm James Tunke with Ion Asia. Thank you for your service.
Hi, James. Thank you.
Is there any common ground between the United States and China on the subject of cybersecurity? And if so, where?
Well, I think the common ground between the United States and China on cybersecurity, which was the question, is clearly our dependence on it. Both nations depend on cyberspace for many things in this day and age. In my world, it's command and control, and in their world, it's equally their ability to command and control their armed forces. But in every area, in economics, trade, commerce, agriculture, I mean, you name it, cyberspace has become part of all of our lives. So undoubtedly, the interdependence of the two governments on that particular commons domain. The need for security in cyberspace is true in China as it is in the United States and everywhere else in the world. So increasingly, allies and partners are coming to us asking to explore what is required in order to secure this commons domain. And part of what's required, frankly, is the international dialogue regarding its security and the establishment of policies and laws that are, that become part of the framework across our globe. Because while those policies and laws remain fragile, cyberspace remains itself vulnerable. And I think we're seeing the effects of that every day. I defend attacks into cyberspace, my command and control networks, every day.
A lot of hands. This woman, right? Is this like, it's so bright, it's tough to see.
Yeah, for us, the lights are in our eyes. So.
Hi, I'm Kristen Jones from the South China Morning Post. Admiral Willard, I was curious whether there have been any specific improvements in the military-to-military relationship since the resumption this year. For instance, in Beijing's response to requests for increased communication at sea, or the creation of protocols for conduct at sea.
Well, the first, I hope everyone heard the question, and it has to do with what has improved, I think, in our military-to-military relations, and specifically insofar as communications and maritime security, some of our conduct at sea is concerned. The singular start recommencement of mill-to-mill relations was the military maritime consultative agreement talks hosted by United States Pacific Command and attended by both the People's Liberation Army and my forces, as well as the Office of the Secretary of Defense and their Ministry of Defense. So we conducted an exchange. That has been, really it was revitalized after the EP3 incident that occurred about a decade ago, and it's intended to discuss and reassert our commitments to maritime safety and air safety, and mainly maritime safety. In the charter for the MMCA, the Military Maritime Consultative Agreement, both sides signed our commitment to the UN Convention for the Law of the Sea, collision regulations, and other protocols that we execute every day as mariners when we take our ships to sea. Additionally, we have some protocols that enhance our ability to communicate with the Chinese. My guidance to our forces, both as Pacific Fleet in my former assignment and now as U.S. Pacific Command, is that we take opportunities to attempt to execute those protocols when we're in proximity to a Chinese ship. We don't always get an answer back from the bridge of the other ship, but we try nonetheless. So MMCA has occurred and is, though it's not yet on our schedule to reoccur, there is a commitment by both sides to place a next MMCA meeting on the schedule. And we have recommenced mill-to-mill. So Secretary Gates' visit, President Hu committed to it when he was here in Washington, and there is an upcoming visit by one of Secretary Gates' counterparts in China that is on the schedule. So we're hopeful that we'll see that occur, and then the overtures that Secretary Gates made to take some of the policy discussions up to the strategic level that I mentioned in my remarks. We're hopeful that the Chinese, in consideration of those, will accept that as well. And then I guess finally we have the strategic and economic dialogue coming up, and on the fringes of that there may be opportunities for other military-to-military encounter.
Good, let's try over here. Trying to get some students.
Good evening. My name is Laura O'Gorman. I'm with Hughes, Hubbard & Reed. Joseph Nye said recently that he doesn't believe that U.S. aid in the Japanese earthquake has changed many many Japanese opinions on the Futenma base. I was wondering what your opinion was on this, and if you think that, America's recent actions have made an impact.
Okay, yeah, thank you. First of all, the humanitarian assistance and disaster response effort that the United States is making on behalf of the Japanese in northern Honshu and the Japanese Self-Defense Force, or in support of them, really has nothing to do with the Futenma replacement issue. We would be offering this kind of humanitarian relief anywhere in the Asia Pacific that a disaster such as the Japanese experienced occurred. In fact, U.S. PACOM conducts disaster response on the average of once every 8 weeks. It happens that this Japanese disaster is particularly acute. It's 3 disasters in one, and it's generated a larger than normal response that will last longer than normal, I think, on the basis of the fact that we have earthquakes, an aftershock of which occurred today, tsunamis, and nuclear accidents that were a consequence of that all in one. So it's a remarkable disaster confluence of events that I've not experienced in my career. Insofar as how it affects U.S.-Japan relations, I would only offer that Prime Minister Khan, in remarks that were exchanged aboard the USS Ronald Reagan by the defense minister from Japan, we're both thankful and very sincere with regard to the assistance that we've given them. We're allies, and naturally we would come to their aid along with about 100 other nations that came to Japan's aid during this particular disaster. So the effect that it'll have on our future relations remain to be seen. How it might affect the Futenma replacement facility and the Defense Policy Review Initiative, the DPRI that is ongoing, with many moving parts and commitment of resource by both nations, I think we'll have to wait and see. The damage to Japan is estimated to be in the neighborhood of $300 billion. And I think the consequence of that economically and with regard to their future programs is something we're just going to have to wait and discuss with them.
There's even some discussion that Japan-China relations are improving as a result of the
I think
disaster.
I mean,
and China's support has led to a more positive feeling in Japan, and that the Chinese have, seen that the Japanese are human and that the history is history. And there's some possibility this will lead to some improvement in a relationship that is actually much tenser than the U.S. China relationship.
Yeah, I think Steve makes a perfect point. I mean, this is, the great leveler is, a humanitarian disaster like this, where regardless of who you are or what you are, you'll generally come to the aid of innocent civilians that are caught up in a disaster such as this one. And the Chinese came to their aid, both with supplies and teams, as well as with monetary benefits. I think a great Chinese actor recently put on a large event in China to raise money for Japan in the course of this disaster. So, I think it sort of levels the playing field when something like this occurs, and we all tend to come to the aid of the innocents that are caught up in it.
Let's see, we have kind of two people in a row, a woman and then a gentleman behind, so we can do, yes, and then right behind and slightly to my left.
Thank you. I'm Kate Walsh from the Naval War College and National Committee member. My question, sir, is how would you characterize today the PLA's role in Chinese national security and foreign policy decision-making? And to what extent do you think that China's leadership transition and planning cycle might perhaps have played a role in recent assertiveness we've seen by the Chinese? Thank you.
Well, thanks. We have every reason to believe that that within China, the Politburo continues to direct the actions by both the PLA and the civilian ministries within China. And I think that is very often corroborated just by a view into state-run media, both English and Mandarin, that we actually explore every day. I mean, to ensure that any messaging that may be forthcoming from the Chinese government that might be reflected in that state-run media is understood by us. So I think, while I contend the PLA is influential, it's influential within a larger governance structure that continues to direct its activities. And I think it's very important to make that distinction. There have been, I know, circles of opinion that that the PLA is farther away from or more influential within Chinese governance than they have been in the past. In 2004, when they elevated the service chiefs within China to become members of the military committee, I think that strengthened the role that those particular military leaders played, and probably strengthened the military, Central Military Commission in general. But in terms of whether or not they are more independent than prior, remember that Hu Jintao is chairman of both. So he runs the standing committee and he is chairman of the CMC. So certainly they have their president himself, who is interlocutor between the two.
Go ahead.
My name is Hajime Matsura. I am senior columnist of Sun News. We are one of the major news agencies in Japan. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude on behalf of my people in Japan for your dedicated support and commitment for Japan. My question is on the issue of security, especially on the nuclear plant. Given that most of the discussions are spoken in the context of humanitarian support or restoration, economic perspective. However, given that, as you mentioned, nuclear issue has added to the third disaster, I view this as a national security issue, as well as a regional security issue, since nuclear plant is the center of the risk right now. Have you ever sensed any kind of risk in that regard, say, some terror might occur in that area, or say our neighboring countries such as North Korea will be operating, taking advantage of this event?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question. Since 9/11, I think the nuclear complexes in every nation have been considered to be at some greater risk than previously, and we've bolstered that force protection around, I know, the nuclear plants in the United States and Europe, and I would offer elsewhere. I think that what has occurred in Japan, which was the consequence, not of an attack, but rather of a confluence of natural disasters that affected these particular plants, is being viewed by all nations of the world that have nuclear power, commercial nuclear power industries within them for the potential vulnerabilities that it may reveal. And as a consequence, we've all read and know that our Nuclear Regulatory Commission and others are falling back on their own commercial nuclear industries and reviewing them for safety across the board. And I think certainly part of that review will be their vulnerability to attacks from outside that are not a natural occurrence.
Is there an NYIT student who wants to ask a question? I mean, Edward and Roger have been so kind in offering us this beautiful venue. We have an NY, good, right there.
Good evening. My name is Shuai Xiao, and I'm an MBA marketing student from NYIT. I have two questions I'm sorry, for you. One is, do you agree with the China threat theory, or you just consider China or the PLA as a powerful competitor? And the second question is, what do you think about the six-party talks about the North Korean nuclear issue? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. First on China, China is not an enemy. I spent most of my career in the Cold War and spent a lot of my career contending with our Soviet counterparts at sea and in the air as an aviator. China is not in that category. We're endeavoring to develop a relationship with China. And I think what's different, what we're all facing is a China that has taken off in the last 2 decades in ways that, from a military vantage point, I've never seen before. A country underpinned by the economic strength that China has enjoyed, developing a military with as broad, as much depth and strength and reach, as they've demonstrated in such a short period of time. The fact that culturally and otherwise they're not completely forthcoming regarding their future intentions and how they intend to use that military has naturally, I think, engendered a nervousness across the region that we've certainly perceived among our allies and partners. And all this under an umbrella of great economic advancement. I would offer that China is enabling nations that otherwise could not have afforded militaries to have military capability. They've afforded nations that were struggling to advance economically to advance now. So there's been great benefit in China's influence over the region and great uncertainty. From the vantage of the United States, they're not an enemy. We don't even declare them as a competitor. We're seeking to find common ground under this very fast-paced evolution of the Chinese military to see if we can't come together and provide security for this very important, what we consider to be the most important economic region of the world together, and to do it in a constructive way, not a destructive way. North Korea is a major challenge for U.S. Pacific Command. If you remember what it was like December 20th, or if any of you were paying attention to what we were contending with December 20th, there was a real risk of conflict that occurred during the course of an artillery exercise by the South Koreans that had followed the attack by North Korea on the island of Waipido in the Northwest Islands region in the West Sea, or to China, the Yellow Sea region. At the same time, as you suggest, North Korea is nuclearizing. And no one, I contend China, the international community, the United States, our regional partners and allies, no one desires to see a nuclear-armed North Korea. And yet, we have determined they have developed nuclear weapons, and they are developing delivery systems. And the six-party talks were a venue to try and stop that. The current discussions that are being proposed between North and South Korea are a venue to accomplish that. But North Korea's intransigence and failure to act in any of these venues responsibly is making any attempt by the international community to contain North Korea's actions, whether in nuclearization or in the next conventional provocation, to cause them to think otherwise and stop their behavior. It's being made more complex by an ongoing succession that's occurring in North Korea, where the youngest son of Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un, has been established as the successor, and we're going through steps that are familiar to us because we saw Kim Jong-il take over for his father and be made responsible for a series of provocations during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s that were equally egregious. So we're in a very, very tough time with North Korea, and the nuclearization issue makes it even more difficult. And it's, I think, incumbent on the international community. It's incumbent on China as a North Korea ally to exert its influence where it can to see North Korea change in these very dangerous actions that we've seen occurring over the past year.
Time for one last short question. And I can barely see. All right, we have somebody who looks very interested, waving hard in the front here, about the fourth row. Up right here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Murayama of Asahi Shimbun, Japanese newspaper, and my first question is arms sales to Taiwan. So Taiwan is repeatedly asking to purchase F-16 and F-16C and D to protect themselves, and without any political implication. I mean, purely speaking militarily. So what is your assessment about the necessity for Taiwan to be equipped with F-16C and D? And secondly, you just mentioned that you are hopeful to have a strategic level dialogue with China in coming SE&D. And actually, SE&D will be held in Washington next month, maybe 1 month or so from now. So could you elaborate a little bit more about what kind of strategic dialogue could be established? I mean, which level, I mean, headed by secretary level, or what kind of agenda are you expected to have? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll go to the last question first, if I may, and talk about Taiwan air capability in a moment. But first of all, the strategic and economic dialogue is co-hosted by Secretary Geithner and Secretary Clinton. So they set the agenda for this. On the occasion that I attended under Secretary Clinton's invitation last year in Beijing, the People's Liberation Army sent a representative into the plenary sessions. So it afforded an opportunity to at least exchange it at that level. I can't confirm that there is a plan to do anything similar, But I would offer that for Secretary Clinton, on the strategic dialogue side of her discussions, often has opportunities both in the plenary sessions and in the breakout sessions to discuss items that pertain to the militaries of both sides. For example, I attended a small group discussion on peacekeeping operations, which is a role played by the militaries of both sides, but the discussion, the policy level discussion, being handled by our respective State Department and Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So there is an agenda that I'll be interested to see unfold when I attend this year, but as you suggest, it'll be in Washington, and I don't know whether PLA representation is forthcoming or not. On the subject of the aviation capabilities of the Taiwanese, the role that PACOM plays in all of this is, is a general assessment of Taiwan's defensive capabilities, and we provide recommendations back into the Pentagon, which ultimately then becomes a study in Washington regarding Taiwan's defense capabilities, future defense needs, and ultimately it unfolds into our interagency and is a decision ultimately made by our administration and Congress regarding what Taiwan arms sales might consist of. In the case of their aviation assets, I've studied the Taiwan military to some extent, and I think that there will come a time when, just as occurs with any air forces within a nation, there will come a time when various aspects of Taiwan's Air Force will require recapitalization, and that's an element of which you allude to. So that decision, whether or not the United States participates in that or not, is a decision made by our administration and Congress in the future. And Taiwan will continue to view into its air forces for their viability, whether they be U.S. capabilities or other capabilities that they've acquired over the years.
As I said when I started out, it has been a pleasure to get to know Admiral Willard, and you can see just why. Thank you so much for this extraordinary tour de force about Asia.
Thank you very much. Thank you.